very belatedly, Jeff, I do apologize. Our first speaker is going to be speaking about basic income and homelessness. So I want to just read this bio in introduction to Jeff Karabanow. Jeff Karabanow is professor and associate director in the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University. He has worked with homeless populations in Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and Guatemala. His research focuses primarily upon housing stability, service delivery systems, trauma, and homeless youth culture. He has completed a film documentary looking at the plight of street youth in Guatemala City and several animated shorts, two of which I hope we'll be able to see today, on Canadian street youth culture. He has numerous academic publications in these areas. Jeff is currently the principal investigator of a SSHRC-funded study on homelessness in Halifax during COVID. He is one of the founding members of Halifax's Out of the Cold Emergency Shelter and is the co-director of the Dalhousie School of Social Work Community Clinic. He is a recent awardee of the Senate of Canada 150 Medal. So with that, can I introduce Jeff Karabanow? Were you able to get that? I apologize. I'm so sorry. Okay, this is the clicker for you. And I have to apologize because I was supposed to upload some videos for Jeff, and I had forgotten to do so. So he's been working hard to get them done. You have the same amount of time. Okay. We'll just cut the break short.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's been really touching hearing actually the earlier speakers kind of welcome this topic area. And it's significant, I think, two pieces for me. One is the notion of kind of compassionate intervention, compassionate and dignified support, which all spoke to, which I think is really, really important that we forget. And then secondly, is this notion of, I think Jeff was the one who noted it right at the beginning, about being human. That's so key. I think a lot of these dynamics get complicated, but it's really about supporting folks and being human. One of my, I used to run a shelter in Montreal called Don Larie, and I remember a young person coming into the shelter. We were closing, it was a drop-in time, and I asked the individual, like, they have to get ready, we have to close down, sorry, you have to get back out. And they said, you know, what's really interesting is out there, I'm a street kid, in here, I'm a human being. And I really think something like a basic income is another example of being human, of providing a compassionate and dignified approach to supporting folks. I'm gonna switch the lens, like this is about homelessness, houselessness, and a basic income. There's not much research on this piece, so it's more kind of a bit of kind of commentary and thinking. All the speakers have highlighted the disaster we're in, the devastation within a housing crisis, within an income security crisis, within a food insecurity crisis. We know the numbers. We see more and more people living rough. I was just thinking when folks were talking about, you know, the coordinated efforts to figure out a basic income. The last few disasters we've had, Fiona, the polar vortex, a bunch of us were on the streets going tent to tent, seeing if folks would move into emergency shelter for just those days. It's amazing that we are doing this in 2023. and B, that a lot of folks had to really think through whether a type of emergency shelter was worth moving into. So we really have to rethink the ways in which we are working and supporting folks. There's been a lot of exploration in the media and academia and civil society around this idea of houselessness, homelessness right now. I'm going to show a short animated piece that was done by young people I was working with. I had an art camp for young people experiencing homelessness a few years back, and this is one of the products. It's a surreal, almost edgy depiction of the horrors of being on the streets, the trauma post street life, the general lack of resources and supports that are out there. We speak about providing these supports, but for folks on the streets, it's a very different lens. And at the same time, though, and why we're moving to calling this houselessness as opposed to homelessness, there's also, while fractured, there's still some deep community connections on the streets that I think really we need to be fostering more and more. I'm going to show this not only to give a picture of kind of homelessness, but also because I think it highlights the core themes of thinking through a basic income, which really are about, houselessness is an income issue. It's a big part of an income issue, being homeless. It's a big part a housing issue. It is deeply stigmatizing and shamed. And while I will talk about how a basic income actually can reverse that. And also, we still tend to see this as an individual issue. We don't recognize the structural drivers. And while there are individual dynamics that are important, they're often mediated by structural drivers. So I think we need to really speak to those structural drivers. So I'm going to show this clip. It's about 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Stan. Take care of that flu.
You smell funny.
It's been a couple of weeks without a shower.
Get the hell away from my daughter!
Thanks.
Coffee for bums, coffee for bums, coffee for bums.
How much you need? 20 cents. Yeah, here you go. Thanks, this is great.
Nothing like meat to get your system going. You new here?
Yeah,
Been happy travels?
better than what I left behind.
Next time, I was ready to quarter chicken.
I ought to show you a place around the corner, in case it storms tonight. No one around. Well, if you need to come here, just tell them I sent you. You know, I'm writing a book. Got a potential publishing deal with some chick at the university. You mind if I use you for my research?
Yeah, go ahead.
You got mind troubles?
Just depression. Makes me feel horrible.
I get anxiety a lot. You ever consider killing yourself?
Yeah.
How long since you ran?
3 years.
What's this line for?
Pudding!
You get sick a lot?
All the time.
What are you feeding on?
Oh, you know.
That shit's gonna kill you. You ever brush your teeth? They say the gums are connected to the heart. When was the last time you had been checked out by a doctor?
Probably when I was born.
Damn, you got a health card?
Nah, you?
Nah, but I get my health checked. You gotta get your shit checked out, man. Hey guys, this is Jimmy.
Hey, what's up, dude?
Oh, I just remembered. I gotta stop by my brother's. I'll catch up with you later. Nah, it's cool here. It's the door. It's a drop-in, but it's a good one.
We could talk about it in a little bit. I'll just continue, unless there's some just important expressions that need to be let out. It's a pretty bleak landscape. This was done by young people. It is their vision of what the streets are like, what services are like, what their role in civil society are like. It was done a few years back, and as I was just at a conference in Chicago, listening to an international narrative of youth homelessness, and nothing has changed. It is, and so it's really important that we hear about the need for coordinated movement and trajectories to something like a basic income. I'm no expert in this field. It was to move this discussion around homelessness, which has had very little discussion with basic income. What we know about a UBI, and I know Mandy's just saying that you guys aren't a UBI. What kind of core pillars, at least, of my sense of basic income is that it's a cash payment that's sufficient to live on. The first piece, without any other supports or earnings, I mean. There's either a slow phase out or no phase out of that if you, when earnings increase, and it's accessible to a larger proportion of the population. Hence that notion of it not being means tested and not targeted. Its prominence has really grown since the 60s and 70s. And I know there's going to be a lot of discussion of kind of the history and the stories. I just remember that I think I spoke the first like 5 years ago, right? And I remember right. I think I was struggling where we had lost our place at Out of the Cold. And I think I was in the worst mood. I'd been struggling all that morning to find a place where we're going to house this shelter again. So I'm in less of a bad mood about that this time around. So 60s and 70s it emerges. There's a lot of good USA and Canadian pilots that are starting to demonstrate the impacts, the positive impacts. We are seeing it more and more in kind of general discussions. Switzerland has a national referendum, 2016, about this. We have a US president, 2017, speaking about a kind of a freedom dividend. And then COVID hits, and there's deep, deep discussions, more so around platforms of how we can actually provide this to populations that are deeply, deeply struggling. The CERB becomes an example of stuff that we actually can do. And then we have the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, which is the first kind of homeless body that starts to discuss a basic income. So there's been flurry of attention, but at the same time, there hasn't been much deeper analysis. What we know about from kind of scoping reviews, and I know you'll be getting into this probably with a lot of more articulate speakers in this area, but what we know, not surprisingly, is that basic income has been linked to much more positive health outcomes, particularly among children, disadvantaged populations, improvements in mental health, some of it reduced just to the stress related to finances. And again, no surprise, right? We know income is a key social determinant of health here. We see decreases in offending and substance-related crimes, non-significant impact on numbers of hours worked, increased return to schooling, right? All these dynamics have surfaced in a lot of different studies. We had a small study in Ontario looking at improvements around housing situations. And from that, we saw that, one of the key pieces, I run now a community clinic where we work with so many folks that are precariously housed. And day in and day out, they have to make very, very difficult decisions around paying rent, paying food, paying medical prescriptions. We saw in this Ontario study that there's a deep reduction in having to make those very difficult calls. And then we have, for the first time, an actual pilot study in Canada that explored homeless populations and a basic income. And it was called New Leaf. We were so close to replicating it here and across Canada. We were like at the last stage of a kind of a, I think, what was the grant called? Like a, it was a Social Science Humanities Research Council grant that was going to allow us to use research funds to support folks. It was like innovation, innovation. It was a new style of granting. We got to the last element, so, but we were unsuccessful. But now I understand that in Vancouver, they're gonna replicate this study for a longer time and to a greater population. But basically, New Leaf, it provided a one-time cash payment, $7,500. This is a few years back. And one-year findings show recipients experiencing homelessness, they exited homelessness quicker. They experienced improved food security. They moved into stable housing quicker, and all those costs were offset by less time spent in emergency shelters. Again, not surprising. So intuitively, emotionally, conceptually, a basic income should prevent and end homelessness. It can constitute a very important structural element of prevention. It's an opportunity to provide this, to address the structural causes of poverty and homelessness. Like, I see it as it can help on the income side of the housing crisis. It can ensure income security. But most importantly, and this is a large caveat, I think, to also the movement of basic income, is that it's got to be coupled still with other policies. And in terms of homelessness, it has to be coupled with social, public, supportive housing supply, right? Something outside of the private market economy. And then also some form of rent control. We need to control that market fluctuation and prevent a basic income from just being kind of absorbed by just rising rents. So those are key caveats to talking about a panacea like basic income. We've been, by the way, very bad in North America around prevention in homelessness. We have been very good at emergency response. And our current policies, can you hear? Yeah. Oh. Good now? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So prevention-wise, and there's a researcher in Ontario, Stephen Gates, who always speaks to this quite eloquently, that our emergency responses, while Band-Aid oriented, are really well developed. But our prevention pieces, and I see basic income as a prevention piece, could be so significant. We tend to just provide targeted support. And provisions of stable housing, typically through social housing or housing first, is limited to small group, while most people who are experiencing homelessness have to go through the short-term crisis intervention mechanisms, which are devastating. And I've written a lot about, while ironically I was part of many shelters, how problematic the shelter system is. So it's the opposite of a universal measure, like a basic income, where everyone's basic needs are met, and thus preventing even the risk of falling into homelessness. What we do now, interesting enough, is that we construct homelessness as a discrete problem, as an individual failure. That's unconnected to these larger social structural drivers. So it's really important that we hear our politicians speaking to this understanding of the structural systemic barriers, right? We're ignoring housing costs that are rising, rental stress, low vacancy rates, decline in incomes at lower ends, increase of casualized precarious labor. and welfare state retrenchment. And at the same time, an intensified welfare conditionality, right? To get welfare, you got to follow particular policy, procedures. So according to two scholars in this area, I already mentioned that. So according to two scholars, not me, but I kind of did a review prior to kind of speaking today, just of what we know about basic income and around homelessness. From their scoping reviews, these are some of the core impacts, right? One is promoting choice in housing, which is key. It's kind of that housing first philosophy. More choice, more control over where you live, basics of what you can eat, when you can eat, and where you can go. So it's linked to housing sustainability. And at the same time, it reduces landlord discrimination, which we know is rampant, right? Folks that are on income assistance consistently argue around the discriminations to find any form of housing. Secondly, it could support return to work. It buffers against job losses. It improves mental health and well-being. A young person we did a study a few years back on young people exiting the streets, getting into supportive and or social housing. We followed them for a year and a half. One young person, it was in Halifax, spoke about how important housing was to them. It made them feel human. I love that idea, right? Like, it's so basic to be able to wake up in your own room, have your own fridge, have your own roof. Being able to control your day-to-day is so significant, and it starts with housing. So, basic income is a huge driver to provide housing for folks. And then also, it reduces strain, by the way, on city and province. Ways, actually, his motion to council, was it last year? Right, kind of argued that would have, not only the benefits to the individual, but also to the municipality, to the province. If you have healthier folks who are exiting the devastation of poverty. Right, so the cost benefits are significant and are being demonstrated so much more now. It also circumvents stigma. Again, moving the argument away from the individual failing to deeper understanding of the structural elements. And lastly, and I found this, so when COVID struck, I was still organizing out of the cold at that time. And also my sabbatical dreams were dashed. When everything shut down and we decided that we needed to move. We were at the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center at the time, and we needed to move folks that were living in a gym. That was another emergency response to a structural housing crisis. We needed to move them into much safer, more dignified, more individualized units. And just through connections with folks at another organization, a hotel manager contacted us, and we started to think through moving folks from kind of an open gym space to actually their own rooms, their own washrooms, their own beds. We had lots of buy-in from all levels of government at that point. And I think one of the reasons at that time was that they could realize that it was also for the collective good, right? We had a massive infectious disease landscape, and everybody needed to have the same protection. I think a basic income also can be driven that way. And I think that could be an argument that it's for the greater good as well. And government funding is much easier to disperse when it has a collective good as opposed to a targeted population. And then, of course, there's some considerations. I'm nearly done if the PowerPoints. I didn't know if I was going to do PowerPoint. I don't want to be lecturing. But then I also, it's nice not to have people look at you, but look at slides. So and these aren't surprising. But first of all, right, the huge worry is that a basic income can replace very important public funded health and social services that are complementary and not duplicative, right? So we're very scared that that could be defunded. For example, like I've noted, a basic income is not going to focus on the supply housing stock side, right? So we need to have that. It's also not going to help with mental and physical health dynamics. We need to have those supports also in place, right? And as time and time has demonstrated, we can't rely on the private market to do that. Secondly, there's a fear in the literature around homelessness and basic income that we're going to pivot away from kind of best practice approaches, and one being housing first. Housing first is just a philosophy of providing basic housing in a dignified manner through choice, and then build those wraparound supports depending on the individual's need, which has really galvanized the lens of how we move forward in a preventive manner around homelessness, that kind of, gets ignored, right? We provide income and then we allow, again, folks to try to survive in the market economy. So we've got to hold on to those best practice approaches. Like I noted earlier, like a lot of my work is with young folks, a basic income, all the discussion is around providing it to families, to adults, and a smaller stipend to dependents. So we don't really know how it can work for like the population that was in that documentary, right? We need to think through, or the animated short, we need to think through that. We do not want the erosion of community informal supports. We need to build that strength through our non-government community-based platforms. And again, lastly, a kind of a broken record on that is that it's got to be paired, especially these days, with an expanded social and supportive housing sector. So I'm going to show one more small clip, and then I'm done. There's limited research here in this arena, but it's an impressive body of literature so far, and it should be a serious policy consideration, not only from the sense that it's, again, a deeply compassionate, dignified way of moving forward, but also homelessness is worsening. What we're doing now isn't working. We have put a lot of funds, we have put a lot of attention from government, from the nonprofit sector into this. And I think it was our mayor speaking to the numbers that are still increasing. So we need to think about things in a different way. And this is why I want to show you this animated clip, which is a story about what happened when COVID struck and the world shut down, and what happened in 2 Nova Scotian communities around the homelessness sector. I highlight it because we're continually moving into disasters. Like I said, I was amazed that with Fiona and the polar vortex, that still the thinking was, let's get them into emergency shelter. And secondly, COVID allowed also folks around the table which I was very fortunate to be part of groups around the table, to think outside the box. Like I said, like the hotel model, to move a shelter out of the cold was the first to do that. We had no clue what we were doing, but it just intuitively made sense to provide a much more dignified, caring, and protected landscape for folks. So I end with this clip. It's like 6 minutes. Because I wonder if we had a basic income, I wonder how this would be different. This is a story about a group of people who tend to be forgotten a lot or ignored. It's a story of folks we call homeless. They're living on the streets, at parks, in shelters, or couch surfing. You've probably seen some. Maybe you've smiled, said hi, given them some change, or maybe you just walked past. It's also a story about a group of folks who work in the homeless sector. It's not a complete story, but a snapshot of a particular point in time. That time was when the world experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, a global disaster. A group of researchers from Dalhousie University and Cape Breton University were interested in documenting the impact of COVID-19 on the homeless sector in two communities, Halifax and the Cape Breton Regional Municipality. That's in Nova Scotia, a beautiful Eastern Canadian province. So we did interviews with people who were homeless during the pandemic and also service stakeholders. We wanted to give voice to the experiences of homelessness during the pandemic. We knew it was bad. We want to know how bad, in what ways, and what responses worked well. And this is what we learned. First, and no surprise to anyone in the field, homelessness itself should be considered a disaster. Yes, the pandemic was a disaster, but homelessness has always been a disaster. Even before the lockdown, shelters were full, people were couch surfing, squatting, living rough. They're outside in all kinds of weather, in parks, on sidewalks, in the woods, anywhere they could find a space to lay their head. Then COVID hit and the world shut down, literally shut down. We were told to stay the blazes home, wash hands, wear masks, physically distance, and we obliged for the greater good. But what about those who don't have homes, can't physically distance, and have no means to buy masks or places to wash? They told us they were basically abandoned. I mean, we're all in the same boat, right? Or are we? We're definitely in the same storm, except some people ride it out in yachts, others in dinghies, while some are just treading water. And a lot of service providers felt very angry about that. Shelters had to reduce the number of beds. Services like drop-ins, health clinics, detoxes, counseling, soup kitchens, all had to close. Even common hangouts like libraries, where you could use a washroom, get a glass of water, use a computer, meet a worker, or get some food, closed their doors. Some nonprofits had to work really hard to get the funds they needed to move quickly to offer help. The impact was real. All in all, those experiencing homelessness felt abandoned, exposed, and isolated. They told us they were left behind. Those experiencing homelessness during the pandemic told us they were more stressed and anxious, that it took both major physical and mental tolls on them. Think about it. The general strain and stresses of living through the pandemic, they're heightened considerably when you just don't have a safe space to be. While being homeless is hard enough, think how adding a pandemic to that puts you basically in survival mode every single minute. And to make things even worse, there's just no available housing to get folks off the streets. Some people tried couch surfing, but we were all scared of each other because we needed to distance and stay in bubbles, so that didn't work. They tried being outside, but that didn't work either, because even outdoor public spaces were off limits for a while. To make matters even worse, Nova Scotia was, and is,
experiencing a housing crisis like it's never seen before. Rents have increased dramatically, affordable housing is in major decline, and expensive condo development is exploding. And then on the flip side, you have really caring and concerned folks, shelter providers, social workers, housing providers, healthcare workers, people from food banks, other nonprofits, and government people meeting pretty much daily during COVID, trying to figure out what to do. Everyone is stressed, scared, confused, and generally anxious. There's no roadmap here, no real plan to navigate the pandemic. But everyone really rallied to keep people safe. Shelters reworked their spaces. Some even moved folks into hotels. Pretty good idea while it lasted. In Cape Breton Regional Municipality, they opened comfort centers to provide basic needs like washrooms, showers, laundry, and a bit of human connection. In Halifax, they piloted a harm reduction initiative where they provided regular doses of alcohol to individuals with alcohol addiction. And a dedicated public health line was created for organizations across the province. It was consistent, trustful partnerships between different organizations that really made the difference. These are all good outcomes, but we need a lot more of this, especially now. So what have we learned about homelessness from living within a pandemic? Going forward, and in thinking about disaster response, we must always have marginalized populations at the forefront of our thinking and think through how responses, policies, programs, and even language include or exclude them. By seeing homelessness as a public health crisis during COVID, housing became understood as a social determinant of health. Thus, the key insight is that accessible, safe, appropriate, and affordable housing for all is a human right. Also, homelessness was a disaster before the pandemic, and people who are living on the fringes are suffering now more than ever. So while there's been some few good things that have come out of this disaster, for the most part, it has deeply amplified the challenges of poverty and housing. The real question is, now that this has been exposed, how do we ensure we don't go back to what we did before? Because that was a world that ignored the disaster of homelessness.
Jeff. Jeff, I want to thank you so much for that presentation and for the opportunity to watch the two shorts that you provided. I think they give us a glimpse into how difficult it is to live without a home and how important it is to help everybody to have their basic needs met. I really appreciate you coming and talking. I'm afraid we're running a bit behind and we don't have time for questions.
I'm going to hang around a little bit. So
Okay, so Jeff will be around if you want to meet with him. I also want to emphasize that because we are